Ooh, didn't mean for that transition to be so abrupt, y'all. Hey, it's Christy. Sorry about that. I switched screens and I didn't have the music on the other scene, so it didn't carry over. So sorry about that. I like to do the fades. I like to make things gentle. How are you guys doing? Oh my gosh, you guys. What? Ooh, Yeah, so hello to everyone in the chat. I just want to say hi there. I see some familiar names. I see Sash. I see Detrolls. The Fae Queen Corey is in the chat. If you guys, looks like the sound is going out. Everything seems to be fine. So hello and good afternoon to you. All right, well, yeah, I couldn't let this day go by and not talk about the historic, game-changing, completely disorienting 24 hours of politics that we had. As an FYI, Kevin can't do a show tomorrow night for the happy hour. Friday night he's playing D&D. Saturday night I'm playing D&D, so I'm not quite sure when we're going to have a happy hour to cover this. And also I had so many thoughts in my head in terms of, I guess I don't need these right now, so many thoughts in my head in terms of what all this meant and just processing it and taking it all in. So I thought I'll just do a live stream. So hello everyone. I'm going to, in the next, 15 or 20 minutes, just talk about my assessment of what happened, and that is based on kind of me wearing a couple different types of hats. On the one hand, there's my political scientist hat, looking at the results, looking at the breakdown of who voted for whom and why, and some of the information that the exit polls captured, and what that could mean for the future. Also some perspective on how political scientists look at this. I mean, one thing that is a kind of a provocative question in political science is, do campaigns even matter? Do you need a campaign at all? And that might sound like a ridiculous thing to say, but last night we saw evidence both for and against that case. Because on the one hand, the campaign itself was very important, but on the other hand, Joe Biden didn't need an organized campaign structure to win, because he didn't have one. So that's a fascinating question. And then I have also my perspective as somebody who considers herself a Democratic, not a party member, because I don't pay membership dues per se, but I identify with the Democratic Party and I support the Democratic Party and its candidates. And so I think for people who are in Bernie world, it might be a little bit difficult to get their minds around why would people suddenly surge behind Biden? Because if you're in Bernie world and that's your perspective, it might be a bit difficult to understand. So I want to come in at from a personal perspective as well, give some qualitative context to the quantitative results. And, well, yeah, okay, I guess let's do a little bit of a recap of where we were about a week ago. About a week ago, we were in a place where Iowa, New Hampshire had voted. Iowa was the state where Pete Buttigieg got the most delegates, squeaking out Bernie Sanders. Not great turnout, on par sort of with 2016, not 2008 numbers, if I remember correctly. Then the next contest was New Hampshire, where Bernie Sanders won. But I think other candidates, kind of like were crowding up at the top. Then they went to Nevada, and Bernie Sanders won there. And I think that the thought at that point internally, from some of the reporting I've heard, is that Sanders kind of wanted there to be a bandwagoning effect. That people saw a winner and wanted to get behind a winner, and that would help carry them forward. Nevada is a little bit of a duck in terms of its place relative to other states. It's a very young state. It sort of skews a lower median age than the rest of America, and it also has a very large Hispanic population. Compared to places in the Midwest and other things. And Bernie Sanders we know from looking at his past voting turnout and who votes for him, he does well with voters under the age of 25, maybe a little bit, let's just call it 30, let's be generous. Voters age 30 and under is a really good predictor of whether or not someone's going to support Bernie Sanders. It's not perfect. He doesn't get 100% of it, but he does get a large enough to, if you're going to put money on it, you'd bet Sanders if you came across a 22-year-old who was voting in the Democratic Party primary. And so with that nexus of he's done well with the Hispanic Latinx population, much better than in the African-American community, the Black voting community. And so going into South Carolina, people were aware of the dynamic that Joe Biden just had. It was maybe a mile wide, but people thought maybe it was an inch deep when it came to Joe Biden, because his numbers with African Americans in South Carolina had been what he was pointing to as his firewall. In terms of I can lose the first 3 races and then just get South Carolina and be fine. And that was it was a necessary strategy because he didn't have a choice. Biden wasn't competing basically in Iowa. There was no way he was going to get a foot in New Hampshire, and he just didn't get on board for for Nevada. So he kind of needed South Carolina to be his firewall. And then, well, in retrospect, here's what I think happened. There was we saw pretty weak. We saw on par with 2016 turnout in the first 3 states. I don't know that Nevada had a massive turnout. I don't remember any particular number standing out that their turnout was that much better than in prior years. There are a lot of voters that it was speculated in Iowa, New Hampshire, maybe in Nevada, who were genuinely torn between the candidates and simply didn't vote because they're like, well, I don't really know who I want to vote for in the primary. I can't decide. So, but I'll vote for whoever is the nominee. I'll vote in the general election for whoever you guys pick. They're all fine with me. Whatever. Just, not Trump. And we don't know this for sure, but there's some speculation that there were people who just were legitimately torn. And so they didn't waste their time in a caucus, or they didn't, make the effort to vote in the middle of January or whatever it was in New Hampshire. But they would turn out in November. But it's kind of hard to test voters who don't show up. You don't really know what's going on there. The other thing that was sort of sitting out there, you want to say almost like a storm, a factor, like another weather front, as it were, going into South Carolina, was that there were a lot of people who were holding off in South Carolina to decide to the last minute. And this is not unusual. I think there's a lot of people who were, I mean, we saw this in New Hampshire too, people who were deciding right after the debate and going for Klobuchar or Buttigieg because of their debate performance. Democratic voters who aren't going for Sanders or let's say Warren, who are more within the moderate and conservative Democratic wing, you say. By conservative Democrats, I mean people who will vote for Democrats but might be may hold an anti-abortion position or something else. Like those Democrats do exist, but or maybe they're just like economically. I don't know why they can call themselves conservative Democrats, but they vote Democratic. People were waiting. They weren't sure about their choices, and so they were open to kind of seeing what happened. And that if a clear frontrunner emerged, because there wasn't so much of a huge difference between Biden and Buttigieg and Klobuchar, or they could kind of float between them. Oh, by the way, I should announce at the start of the show, I should have said this first. Breaking news, Mike Bloomberg is now out. He dropped out of the race and endorsed Joe Biden. So he's another former candidate who's in getting behind Biden. So again, the field narrows even more because some of the vote we saw that happened on Super Tuesday is speculated could go for Biden. I mean, maybe some of those people drop out, who knows? But yeah, so we've got nobody running. And here's Bloomberg dropped out, Klobuchar dropped out. So we're down to 3, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. I also will take this time to announce I am still officially undecided for the Wisconsin primary because I don't know, candidates keep dropping out. And I've already said I won't vote for Bernie Sanders because I vote for Democrats. And minimum 5-year continuous membership in the party disqualified both him and Bloomberg. So, at this point, we'll see what happens with Elizabeth Warren. And maybe she will make my choice for me. I don't know. She's taking some time off, a couple days, to reassess, and we'll see. I mean, these things can be very rapidly changing and fluid, as we've seen in the last week. All right, getting back to now the narrative. You had people who were undecided. There wasn't a clear sort of moderate, front runner happening there, and the first 3 contests, taken in total, skewed very white. So not representative of the kind of base that turns out for Democratic elections across the country. And we're seeing the effects of this, of what happens when you go to states that are not dependent on white voters in a Democratic primary. What happens? Joe Biden didn't have money, didn't have machinery. His message is sort of let's go back to let's get back some honor and dignity in the White House, and let's continue making improvements to Obamacare. Let's pass the Violence Against Women Act. Let's pass some gun safety regulations. Let's work on climate change. It's not the economic revolution package that Bernie goes on about, but it's one that Republicans will find offensive and one that Democrats will respond to because it ticks all the traditional boxes, which include boxes of women's issues and civil rights issues and issues of racism and criminal justice reform. Not just about framing everything in terms of corporations or big money or big banks. So it seems to me what happened with South Carolina is there was a whole group of Democrats who weren't behind Sanders, who were nominally getting behind other candidates that they liked, but weren't wedded to, weren't passionate about. And in a sort of a flip, when Barack Obama ran in Iowa for the first time and Iowa gave him the victory, it sort of gave an imprimatur or sort of like an aura around him of okay, he's electable. He can get whites to turn out for a Democratic primary. And this time, it was that support that Biden has built up in the Black community going back decades. There is the fact that people recognize he stood by Barack Obama and supported Barack Obama. And I don't know that people who are white kind of appreciate what that kind of connection does, and how people are willing to, maybe they'll be doubtful about you, but if you give them a reason to come back home to Joe, they would. And Jim Clyburn was the reason to come home to Joe. I think when the vote turned to South Carolina, James Clyburn stood up next to Biden, because again, Biden didn't win this. Biden didn't win. It was black voters who decided the Democratic primary this in the last 24 hours. It's black voters who decided Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. All right. So I'm not giving a whole lot of credit to Joe for what happened in the last 24 hours. He has a history and a political legacy that he brings with him. But he was carried over the line. So the first person was James Clyburn. And if you think about him sort of standing next to Joe and putting his hand on his shoulder saying, I'm with him, you can almost visually picture 2/3 of black voters in South Carolina standing behind James Clyburn, putting their hand on his shoulder and then the hand on the next shoulder. And suddenly what happened was there was this Joe Biden who was standing there sort of all forlorn in the white states. There was just this coronation almost, this sort of ascent. Like black voters in South Carolina said, we trust Joe. This is the person who we want in this office. And it was such an overwhelming statement. I think he ended up with 49% of the vote and over 60% of the black vote. And he tied in the traditionally great Bernie Sanders under 25 or under 30 demo, and then just wiped the floor with Sanders in every other age cohort with black voters. And once that happened, once there was clarity for Democrats like myself, and for others around the country. I mean, I think South Carolina, undoubtedly, it wasn't just James Clyburn's, it was how people reacted to it and how black voters came out behind Biden. Other people saw that. And that moment of clarity, it gave, it made something quite realistic for two other candidates, Klobuchar and Buttigieg. They didn't have a path forward. And at some point, if you're not going to win the presidency, you have to get out. And the question politically becomes, when do you get out and why? And what do you want to get out of getting out? So, maybe you want to be able to negotiate a bill or something else. Like if you're going to get out, it's political capital, right, to get out. And it's also political capital to endorse. So I wouldn't be surprised at all in terms of like making connections or whatever else that those things happened. But when Klobuchar and Buttigieg not only dropped out, but then went to Texas to rally behind Biden, and subsequently, like, all of their supporters heard that and saw that. Again, that was sort of like echoing the same clarion call of right, this is the guy, right? This is our party's nominee. And Amy and Pete stood next to Joe and said, I want all my supporters to stand behind him as well. Beto O'Rourke showed up on stage, and from a Texas native and resident, I don't know if he's born in Texas. He lives there now though. He also was like a hometown boy who was running, who's getting behind the party frontrunner. And this is the power of party. This is something that people like June and others are dismissive of. You want to destroy the Democratic Party as an institution, or it's corrupt as an institution, or something like that. But the reason why that rally was so important to Joe Biden is because it rallied us not to Joe Biden the person. It rallied people that this is the Democratic Party, and Bernie's not, he can run as a Democrat, but we know he's an independent. He doesn't have a lot of support from his colleagues on the Democratic side. And you want your team to do well. You want your team to win. You want to get the White House. You want to protect the Constitution. And so it felt like, at least, again, for me, the energy really changed between the black voters coming out so powerfully and then the party unifying without acrimony or attacks or slights or any of that, just warmly embracing Joe Biden. That unleashed not only the support of Klobuchar and Buttigieg voters, but a whole bunch of undecided people suddenly didn't have to make a choice anymore. And their choice had already been sort of, validated or ticked off by, hey, black voters in South Carolina just didn't like, they were not unclear. They were like, this is the person we will come out for. This turnout in South Carolina was amazing. Bernie keeps talking about the turnout he's promising in the general election. You need to turn those people out now. And when it came to turnout yesterday, where there was massive turnout, that benefited Joe Biden. So all of the arguments, Bernie had been making about his electability and his ability to turn people out and energize new voters and expand the base, what we saw was traditional Democratic base voters coming out for a traditional Democratic base candidate. Nobody saw it coming. No one saw this coming. In terms of the actual result, when Kevin and I were on the happy hour last time, we were saying Joe Biden was going to have a great night if he managed to only lose California to Bernie Sanders by 60 or maybe be trailing by 100 delegates. Well, what happened when all those things came together for Joe Biden, when black voters stood in solidarity behind him and white candidates came together and stood behind him? It brought back the Obama coalition. That coalition of black voters and suburban, especially women, turning out and sort of scooping up that sort of moderate, less liberal part of the party. And there's just more Democrats there because Sanders relies on groups that are the least likely to turn out, which is younger people. And he's also banking on people who've never voted before. And that's super, super difficult to get people to vote for the first time. It's much easier to get people who already vote to vote for you. All right, so let me see how many of my points I've already gone through, because I had a whole list here. You can't see it, but all kinds of things. Right. The vote started coming in. And you had the weekend, you had the Saturday caucus, and then the Sunday shows. And then Sunday was the rally. And Monday, I feel like something happened good for Biden on Monday too, but I can't remember what that might be. And then on yesterday, the floodgates opened and Democrats poured into voting places. What we saw over and over again was that when we got the early vote from states, all of the pre-South Carolina results, they tended to favor Sanders and Bloomberg just more than the same day vote. And what we were seeing across state after state was that people who were deciding late were breaking for Biden. There were even people who had their ballots who had voted for Buttigieg or Klobuchar. In California, if you bring back your ballot, you can exchange it for a new one and vote, to change your vote. You can't vote twice, but you can replace your ballot, changing their votes to Biden. And when I was starting the evening, I had a chart. The estimates when the polls were closing was that Biden would win 7 states and Sanders would win 7 states. And instead, last time I counted, Biden had won 9, Sanders had won 4, Maine was out, and California was too close to call. I don't know if those numbers add up correctly, but Biden just blew him out of the water. So what did I want to? I wanted to look at some numbers here. What was I setting up? Oh, wait, I might as well talk about this. Yeah. The other thing I found on Twitter when I was looking for stuff and filling time till the polls closed was someone had circulated the list of states that were up for Super Tuesday that Bernie the number of delegates he should get per state. And if you total them all up at the end, he would get like 606 total delegates. And so I wrote down all of the states and the predicted, their tracking numbers, like how many delegates should we get out of this state, how many delegates should we get out of that state. And then I went this morning. Obviously, they're not all completed because there are still, I think, some delegates to be assigned, especially in California. So, take that part of it out. But then I went through the actual results, the current ones as assigned. So as of this morning, it was like 5 hours ago or so, Alabama, they predicted they wanted to get 11. They got 7. Net loss of 4. Arkansas, they were aiming for 9. They got 8. Pretty close, but 1 short. California, they're looking to get 210. So far, they're at 72. And Biden is pretty close, so we're going to see. Colorado, they wanted to get 38 delegates. They got 20, so down 18. In Maine, they wanted 24. They got 8, down 16. Massachusetts, they were looking for 33. They have been assigned 26 so far, so that's missing 7. Minnesota, they were looking for 33. I've got them down with 26, also down 7. North Carolina, they were looking for 46 delegates, got 26. So that's a loss of 20 predicted delegates. Oklahoma, predicting 9, got 13. First time, only time they got more delegates than they'd predicted. Texas, 20, got 15. Tennessee. I was just wondering, how can that be Texas? That seems not very large to me. So Tennessee, they're looking for 20, got 15. Texas, they were looking for 86. They've got 50 so far. Last time I checked, that's lower by 24 delegates. Vermont looking for 21. They got 9. What is that? VE. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's not a V. It's a U. Utah. That was it. Okay, sorry. In Utah, they were looking for 21 delegates and were been assigned 9. Vermont, they were looking for 16, got 11. And in Virginia, looking for 32 and got 31. So, now that we've talked about all the things that went right for Biden, maybe we should talk about what went wrong for Bernie. Let me just go through my list here of points that I did scratch out before the show, because I have all of these thoughts that go through my head as I'm getting ready for a show, and sometimes I remember things that Christy, you should say that. Other times I don't, so today there was just too many, so I wrote them all down. Bloomberg out, tick. Before and after South Carolina, yeah, talked about that. Okay, yeah, that one. Expectations, late surge, role of party versus running against the party. I think I talked about that. Joe Biden was able to rally people and a lot of undecided voters to him who identify as Democrats because of that party link. And when you crap on it and you crap on the party and you crap on the institutions and you crap on the people who run it, your base isn't, you're not going to motivate people who are loyal to it, not loyal to the party, but loyal to the values of it and the idea that we've done good as a party in the past and we're not perfect, but we're better than the alternative and you should get behind our nominee. Biden owes black voters big time. Definitely covered that. And yeah, let me just talk about this. Do campaigns matter? It sounds like at least to me, it sounds like a very provocative question, but in some ways, Biden didn't have a campaign structure at all. He didn't campaign at all, I think, in Virginia. He had one office in Virginia. He won Virginia. He didn't have, much to do. He wasn't on the air in Massachusetts. He won Massachusetts. So people are self-motivating. Voters do get to the polls when they have a motivation. And we talk a lot about ground game and turnout, and yeah, it's sort of important till it isn't, or, maybe we give it more important than it does. But the whole, sort of conundrum of how Joe Biden managed to pull off this mass voter mobilization that left Bernie in the dust. This wasn't down to Joe Biden. This was Democratic voters motivating themselves. And again, primarily, the Democratic candidate has been selected because of the clarity and the decisions and the turnout, fabulous turnout of black voters. You can't not put this down. This isn't, Joe Biden wins the delegates, but the people here who really should get the credit are the voters, especially South Carolina and James Clyburn, but of course, just voters in the South generally. We might have a chance to take a look at it. Biden got 72% of black voters in Alabama. 72%! That is mind-blowing. That is just, yeah. So, how black voters determine the next president. And then they got some stuff more on rhetoric. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about, before I go, who didn't vote for Bernie. Let me be clear who did vote for Biden. Who were these people who were turning out? Half of the voters who voted in a lot of these states decided in the last week whom to vote for. All right, so that is a huge, huge reason why Joe Biden could capitalize on the moment. He had people who were floating. And again, that rallying bandwagon effect, if they had rallied around a candidate they didn't like, people didn't turn out, but people are okay with Joe. He's not great. He's not perfect, but they all know he's better than Trump. And they already said no to Bernie, or they would be voting for him. So if it's not going to be Bernie, then who is it going to be? Joe Biden, that's great. We know Joe. Yeah, he messes up, but whatever. Right? I think a lot of that happened. And who was voting for him? Older voters. Why is this an advantage compared to Sanders? Older voters turn out at a higher rate, and they turned out in terms of percent, like the support he got was, a higher percentage of support than Sanders gets. Sanders wasn't cracking those older demographics. They were being owned by Biden. Moderate and conservative Democrats, amongst, as we'll see, probably moderate self-identifying Democrats, or those Democrats that identify as conservative, Biden just swept up those votes. And those people exist. And Bernie isn't appealing to them. So they go to the natural place of the candidate who does talk to their concerns, and that's Joe Biden. Black voters, we already talked about his link with the community and how when he was taking some lumps, he started the support started to drift, but it's easier to get to people to come back to you who know you, who maybe flirted with another candidate, than to convince someone who's never supported you to support you for the first time. And so that rallying cry helped. And then the late deciders. The fact that he had just so many votes to convert, half of the votes on the day, he won in the last, say, 72 hours. And polls can't pick that up. He can't you can't pick up when people don't know. And the thing that does annoy me a little bit, I guess annoy is kind of a strong word, but when we see these polls of, Bernie Sanders at 26% and Biden at 24%, and then Buttigieg, back in the day, they don't say what percentage of people were undecided. And if half the electorate was undecided, well, then Bernie's advantage looks a lot softer. Anybody's advantage looks a lot softer if you've got half the electorate still, waiting till election day to make up their minds. Because it means they're not with you as a front runner. So, oh my gosh, let's take so the problem that Bernie had is that he dominated in groups that didn't do well in a Southern dominated primary. And even though, like I said, everyone was talking about California, there were more states online than California, and I know there's a lot of delegates there, but I think people were talking about California because Bernie was talking about California. And I forgot where I was going to go with this, but we're going to look at some numbers here. Coming in, the first state I think came in was North Carolina. Am I remembering the order of North Carolina came in first? And that, if we're going to look at the full results here, we see that Biden ended up with 43% of the vote, Sanders at 24%, Bloomberg at 13%. Warren had a terrible night. I mean, we haven't really talked about Warren because we've been talking mostly about Biden, because what happened was, again, I feel like I'm wrong in giving credit to Biden for this. I think we should talk about the black vote in the Democratic Party has won, has basically shifted, got white people to go, oh, okay, yeah, right, of course. Why were we humming and hawing about this? Joe, all right. So let's take a little look at the results here. This is a great interactive thing, by the way. I mean, I love the Washington Post. I happily pay for that. More so, New York Times, their graphics are just, So we've got Joe Biden here, 43% of the vote, gets 35 delegates. Bernie Sanders gets 15. Got some county level results. If we're interested in the geography, we're not. We're going to go straight for the demographics. So let's say this breakdown. Here's a demo that we haven't really talked about in terms of sex and gender. We've got the very cisnormative binaries here, but when it came to men, they were 43% of the voters. 27% of all men went for Sanders. In North Carolina, 42% went for Biden. With women, Sanders did more poorly. They got a 50, and they're 57% of the voting population. So a bigger percentage, and they were less likely to support Sanders and as likely to support Biden, which means more votes for Biden. Even though men and women in North Carolina voted for Joe Biden at the same rate, the fact that 43% of the voters were men meant that women's larger proportion gave Biden a big boost. White, we saw 25% of all white voters going for Sanders, 34% going for Biden. Black voters, 27% of the electorate, only 17% went for Sanders, 62% went for Biden. And Hispanic voters actually outperforming white voters in terms of that. I don't know, I guess with Nevada, I don't know if you get enough of a pattern. You can look at Hispanic Latino voters there to see if they tend to outperform whites or if North Carolina was a one-off. And then we talked about the important age demographic. People under the age of 29, 57% of them went to Sanders. However, they only made up 14% of total voters. Whereas when you get down here, 65, we'll go like 45 to 64. That's my age range. Only 18% of them went for Sanders. 47% went for Biden, and they were almost twice the number of voters that actually showed up at the polls. Let's take a look at Biden did better with people without a college education or a college degree. I shouldn't have college education. That sounds a degree, because you could have some college and not have a college degree. Who did you vote? When did you decide? In the last few days, and this here was in case of North Carolina, a third of the voters. Of those, more than half of those people who showed up and decided, like in the last few days, went for Biden. Even deciding before, Biden still won North Carolina on that demo. And when it comes to ideology, here's again, this is a problem that Sanders has. He does very well with the liberal wing of the party. The liberal wing of the party is much bigger in California and parts of New York and maybe in parts of upstate New England. But in the South, they're 23% of all the Democratic voters. That means 75% of the voters are not self-identifying as very liberal. Somewhat liberal, you can see immediately, just going from very liberal to somewhat liberal, Biden did better. And those who consider themselves moderate or conservative Democrats, he did the best. So that was South Carolina. We can't go by these. I mean, I would have a whole night of these state by state. You're going to have to go maybe, and if you don't have a subscription, I don't know, I'll give you a pass or something. But let's take a look at, let's take a look at Minnesota. So, okay, let's first, going back. So Bernie was relying on younger voters who are a smaller proportion of the voting population. He also was trying to bring in new voters, first-time voters. There's no evidence he's doing that. And he seems to like really want to agitate white voters. And it's sort of, well, I have a theory about the way that Bernie runs his campaign. But he kind of, he should have learned from 2016. He needs to listen to and connect with Black Americans and not just the ones who agree with him. He needs to kind of get out of his comfort zone. And so I guess I may as well talk here about my critique of Bernie's approach. I listened to his victory speech. What was the one? Nevada. The Nevada victory speech. And then I listened to the speech he gave on Tuesday night. And it was essentially the same speech. And this is what I always hear from Bernie, right? So as someone who doesn't agree with, I agree with the general policy goals, and I even agree with the general policy outcomes, okay? When Bernie talks, he's not talking to me. And I think this is part of the problem, is that the way Bernie and his supporters see the world, and this is my speculation, but based on my interactions, I understand the working class problems, therefore I speak for the working class. Whether or not the working class actually says I speak for them, right? So there's assumed authority there to speak, like I think Bernie feels he's entitled to speak for me as a worker because I'm a worker and he gets the workers thing. Whether or not he gets me in reality is sort of unimportant. The thing is, he's like, oh, here's a voter. Here's how my economic message, this is where you fit into my ideology. And when you listen to Bernie's speeches, everything is framed in terms of opposition to either a billionaire or a corporation or some sort of, people who have currently have power. I guess in there I'm thinking about the Democratic establishment, this nebulous concept of people just like him who have been elected to office and have been there for decades. But he talks about, he always starts with, being a worker and wages and healthcare. And I understand, like I said, I understand that. But he talks about environmental justice by going after polluters. And he talks about, and breaking up the big banks, and talks about, like getting big, like lending out of student loans. Everything is framed in terms of this economic critique. He's always coming at you through resentment that other people have money and you should have more money, or you pay too much for something and you should pay less, which, is a part of the critique I get, but that's 100%. Like, I feel that if I wanted to hear Bernie talk about access to contraception and abortion access and restrictions that GOP people are placing and the contraception approval for your employer and all of these legal, moral issues, he wouldn't be interested. The only way he would talk about abortion would be through the idea that it's an economic decision. Like, women should have the right to control their fertility because it's an economic decision. So I never feel like he is talking to me. I never feel like he is speaking to the things I care about. And for all the flaws of Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren as well, and Joe Biden, and everyone as a candidate is flawed, when they talk about America, they talk about all Americans. Joe Biden talks about, school kids and wanting to get better public education and wanting to deal with gun laws and wanting to deal with criminal justice reform and wanting to deal with climate change and wanting to bring people together. And he paints a vision of America that actually brings people together. And Bernie always paints a picture of division. In Bernie's picture, we're always fighting somebody who owes us something, or we should take it away from them, or it needs to be controlled, or something has to be redistributed. And for people who want to have that fight, that's great. But I want to see, when Joe Biden talks about the America he sees, about like the things that he and Barack did together to bring people together and how they helped people's lives and they did this they did that together, I see that America. I see that vision. And all I see when I hear Bernie talk is class warfare. So this is why I think his appeal is quite limited. It's why older voters aren't interested in his revolution, and it's why black voters don't hear their concerns unless they're framed economically, environmental justice and and things in that way. There's very short shrift, and it's his campaign's inability to figure out how to connect to other voters. And so this brings me on to the point that I wanted to make. Joe Rogan said that the great thing about Bernie was that he's been so consistent over time and he's had the same views that he's held forever. And this is I think also his Achilles heel. Bernie is now at a crisis moment where he has to decide, is he going to change his message to widen his base of support? Or is he just going to continue to do what he's always done, which is find an enemy and contrast himself against it? And if his enemy is the Democratic Party and the candidates in the Democratic Party, and, how do you reach out to people who just voted for Biden or have seen all the support for Biden if you're going after Biden more than Trump, So, and so one is he going to actually change who he attacks? Or how is he going to change his message to reach people like me? I mean, he can't, because I'm never going to vote for him. But there are people like me probably who might vote for him in upcoming states. So how do you speak to the suburban moms And there's not just white women in the suburbs, everyone. But how do you speak to suburban moms who are worried about their 401k right now, Bernie? And to say, oh, I want to give you Medicare for all is not an answer. You can't say, oh, I don't want to talk about this part of your concerns. Here's where you should agree with me because I'm already right. And can Bernie change? I think that's actually the really interesting question going forward is we see now where his vulnerabilities are. And we've seen that he does not turn out the people he promised would make the difference in the general election. And also, can I just say this? This is going to be very unpopular, but I'm going to say it anyway. I am so glad we had this vote now for Bernie. This disastrous, nobody except young people, just a complete bottom falling out now. I mean, he was supposed to win Minnesota. He couldn't win, he lost delegates, I think, in Vermont. He got 87% of the vote in Vermont last time, and Sanders had viability. He lost votes compared to his home state in 2016. People didn't show up for him. I mean, can you imagine if we would have put him in front of Trump and this would have happened? It would have been Dukakis, and people aren't old enough to remember Dukakis, but Reagan, just wiped the floor. Mondale, too. Mondale, actually, I think it was Reagan. I don't know who Dukakis ran against. It was a long time ago. Maybe that was Bush. Walter Mondale won one state and some territories or something. I mean, if Bernie had this turnout against Trump, we would have another Trump term. So Bernie can get a certain percentage of people who support him and a certain percentage of the Democratic base to turn out. But he can't even get the whole Democratic base to get over on his side. And, this shellacking that he got, I mean, oh my God, Biden won Texas! Biden won Texas! Bernie was supposed to just carry Texas. That was supposed to be a huge win for him, and Biden won, except for California, the state with the most delegates, after having run up a 100-point lead in the South. And where does Bernie go from here? I honestly, he'd have to pull some sort of inside straight, but with what voters? With what voters? Because the people who are turning out for him right now aren't putting him over the top. And we're looking at coming up. We got Louisiana. We got Georgia. Florida? You think those pro-Castro comments are going to go over well in Florida? He's not going to catch Joe Biden there. Maybe New York State. But if Joe Biden is competitive, so where does Bernie blow out Joe? But if the race stays the same, all things being equal, now obviously things could change. Joe Biden could have a heart attack tomorrow. Who knows what could happen? But all we can do is sort of 5 days ago, all we had was Bernie was doing well. And so we forecasted out California based on the assumption that the election would pretty much stay the same because mostly things kind of stay the same. But now Joe Biden is leading in the delegate race. Joe Biden is probably leading in the popular vote. Joe Biden has just swept 9+ states on Super Tuesday. He's cleared out all of the competition in the moderate lane and has, Bloomberg's got the offices. Bloomberg's got the staff. Joe Biden doesn't have any of that, but, if they're going to rally behind him and give their voter lists and all that stuff, he's just going to walk into it because of black voters. All of this is down to Joe Biden should get down on his knees every day and thank black voters across America. You just have a committee, you just tell me how you want to run things because basically I owe you the presidency. What can I do for you? Which would be nice because they've been owed that for a long time. But yeah, so Bernie can't get out of this by going after the DNC. Bernie can't blame Elizabeth Warren. If Elizabeth Warren gets out, there is a very good likelihood that at least half of her supporters are going to go to Biden because Sanders supporters were so awful to her. And if they really supported Bernie, they would have already been with him. So, getting Warren out doesn't solve Sanders' problem. Maybe you'll get a few more suburban moms if you get a Warren endorsement, but that won't make up with, there's no big cachet of black voters that have just been supporting Elizabeth Warren. And that's where his problem is. Oh my. So Biden didn't cut a deal with Warren. I know that Elizabeth Warren is a woman who is capable of making decisions on her own, so please don't have that kind of sexist, Elizabeth Warren is a tool of Joe Biden. She's her own person, and she's running her campaign the way she wants, so knock that off. Anything else? Amy and Pete saved his ass. No, black voters in South Carolina, and then all of the people who turned out saved his ass. I think Amy and Pete helped rally a lot of white voters, because they don't do well with black voters. Neither of them were. None of them were. And so, for those moderate-leaning Democrats in places, like California and in other states, Minnesota, obviously Klobuchar was, oh my gosh. I mean, you want to talk about one place where the Klobuchar endorsement did help. Last time around, Minnesota was a caucus state and Bernie won it. This time it was a primary state, and he got his ass handed to him. Handed to him in Minnesota. Let's take a look at Minnesota. He went from winning to getting 30% of the vote. Let's have a look at Minnesota. Let's see what white people in Minnesota were doing. Because these were, again, the people who supported Sanders. Well, in the caucus system, again, primary, there was a massive increase in turnout and participation because they went from a caucus to a primary. So again, you've got this gender, sex difference. This is an unspoken thing, but I think it's important. We hear a lot about the youth divisions, and obviously Bernie does better with Hispanic and Latinx voters. He does very poorly with black voters, does sort of in the middle with white voters. But he pulls men, and men don't vote at the same rate as women. Here again, we got 42% of the turnout was men voters, 58% of Minnesota voters were women. That is almost 60% of turnout, and they went 41% for Biden. Right? Sanders was almost evenly split between men, and had men turned out in a greater proportion, he wouldn't have won, but he might have done better. But there's something about Bernie's message not winning over women, and that's not a conversation we hear in the media a lot, but maybe it's time to start talking about it. Because I know why I don't like to be shouted at by an angry old man who doesn't talk to my issues. But a lot of guys apparently like the anger. When it came to voters, oh, look at this. This is interesting. Oh, only 6%. Okay, so 6%. He did very well with Minnesota, although it was basically Biden still won the black vote here in Minnesota. But Sanders did much better with black voters in Minnesota than Biden did. And with white voters, yeah, Biden actually, not quite doubled that. Looks like in terms of age group, again, he really dominated with those under the age of 29, 65% to Sanders, but not even 20% of the total turnout. Whereas people over the age of 65, who were a quarter of the turnout, 59% went for Biden. And then combine that with the 32% of 45 to 64s, and he's just getting blown out. So, let's see. When did you decide? People who decided in the last few days broke overwhelmingly for Biden. And people who had, I think people who were for Bernie were for Bernie for a long time. So that really maps on, that makes sense. That number wouldn't make sense any other way. Sanders got half of very liberal voters. They made up 24%, but moderate or conservative Democrats made up 34%, and they broke 58%, for Sanders. So a few percentages more and a bigger percentage of the population. And this is where all of this under the surface, these are all the churnings that were happening. These numbers are fascinating. I know. I could do a whole show just going by state, reacting to this as we learn. And yeah, in terms of this electability issue, this comes down to, do you want the Democratic Party campaign to be about economically transforming the country, Or do you want to talk about how we beat Donald Trump and create a vision for the future? Because revolution is not a vision for the future so much. It's fighting. It's like identifying people to fight. And 65% of voters are looking for someone who can beat Trump. And people, I guess, again, for the Bernie people and maybe my European friends are like, how is this possible? Because the economic situation there is so bad. I think what I would say is, like, if you think of the economic inequality and all of the problems that I admit we need to, like, right to work needs to go and unions need to come back. And there are all kinds of things that we can do once we get Republicans out of the way and we get the House and the Senate and the White House and we get our stuff in order, right? There is a long list of things economically that need to get fixed in our system. But if you're like me, I would say liberal, but not very liberal Democrat, I see Donald Trump tearing down the Constitution now. And if he gets another 4 years, I don't know that we're going to have votes and elections in the future to get him out. So if I'm a doctor and a patient comes in and they have bronchitis or they have cancer, but it's not going to kill them, and they've also been shot and they're bleeding out, I'm not going to talk about the cancer and the long-term treatment and their chemo. I'm going to stop the bleeding. I have to make sure the patient survives before I can deal with the longer-term problem. And I think for Democrats like me, who agree, this is it. We don't want people to die for lack of health care. We don't want billionaires to suck up all the money. But we recognize that the first thing is to find a candidate who can get Trump out of office. We have to save the patient first. We have to deal with the bleeding. And if you think the Constitution's not important because that liberal democracy just covers up capitalism, then that won't make sense to you. If you grew up, as I did, with I'm Just a Bill and Schoolhouse Rock and all that kind of stuff, and you like having a peaceful transfer of power between parties, then Trump is a threat to that. And that is the most important thing in this election. So, so as we're going forward, I think people are still processing this. We're still waiting to see California. I know a lot of the early vote was in California, a lot of vote by mail. So there's also going to be like days of waiting while post gets. Whoa, that was violent, sexy dancing. While the post travels around the state and people open up their ballots and vote and count them and everything. So we won't have a clear answer out of California in the next 6 hours. But, at this point, everybody is out except for Warren and Sanders. Joe Biden has just had this massive surge, and nothing helps winning like winning. And I know, there is a big psychological bandwagoning effect. If you know that you're going to vote, you've got a choice and you go vote for a losing candidate or a winning candidate, and there's really not a huge motivation, like ideologically or some issue to, make you stick with the losing candidate, and I'll vote for the winner. So he's got that going for him. And yeah, I don't see, the question now is where can Bernie pick up delegates to stop Joe Biden, which is not a sentence I thought I would be saying 24 hours ago. No, it just didn't occur to me that we would be in a position where Joe Biden was up on Bernie Sanders. That possibility never entered my mind. So do I think Biden can beat Trump? Yes. The one thing that we didn't talk about too much was how phenomenal turnout was in some of these places. I think there were places where, voter turnout was up 100,000 votes. The numbers that we saw for Biden, and this is it, the numbers we saw for Biden in terms of massive turnout, we're getting close to 2008 levels. So again, and I'm really glad you asked this question, when I said that there was this sort of groundswell of undecided people who weren't showing up because they didn't know necessarily, I think we can now say that is a good hypothesis to explain the mediocre turnout in the first 3 contests. Because when you had a motivated base that's a traditional Democratic base, who feels the effect of Trump. They know what it's like living under Trump. Like they see very clearly. They're not about economic revolution unless, maybe they're the 18-year-old age demo for Sanders. But they showed up in force. And when they did, that created a cascading effect. And so if we've got that much, if we're seeing spikes in turnout, and they're spikes that are not driven by the Biden campaign. Can I just reinforce this? These are people who are motivating themselves to get out to the polls without a formal structure, without necessarily being pestered all the time by all the campaigns. They are getting out and voting for that candidate on their own volition. That means that they want Trump out. And so every time we see a surge in turnout with numbers that are closer to 2008, we are closer to that Obama coalition. And that is a coalition that Trump absolutely fears. So Joe Biden doesn't need to be perfect. I think that this is what people get wrong. That people want to pick on Joe Biden and say he's not a great candidate. But that's not what's really important. What's important is, are there enough people who think he's more competent than Trump and are willing to vote for him? And I don't see how the answer to that is going to be yes. I think I bookmarked this story. It didn't get too much play, but more independents, if I remember this headline correctly, than Republicans. I saw a headline, and I don't know if it was on a state level or nationally, but no, that's not what I wanted. Yeah, this is what I saw. 5 days ago. It's weird how things stick in your head. I saw this and I bookmarked it for the happy hour, but we didn't get to it. But I remembered it. This is something else too that we need to keep in mind. So from the Washington Post, from the Fix, for the first time, there are fewer registered Republicans than independents. Independents might in part be surging because of the Never Trumpers, right? People who used to be Republicans, who have so disgusted by Donald Trump that they can't vote for him anymore. They've actually disassociated for the Republican Party. And you want to know who those people can vote for? Joe Biden. So whatever hemorrhaging we get from the rage-quitting Bernie bros, which, I saw Vosh, to his credit, said he was going to vote for Biden. I hope Shoe on Head is making a video saying that she's going to vote for Joe Biden the way I said I would vote for Bernie Sanders in the general. And so those people who couldn't vote for Sanders can vote for Biden. So from a tactical point of view, to get Trump out, yes, Joe Biden can win. For the first time in history, there are more registered independents in the United States, the whole of the United States, than there are registered Republicans. New data, which tracks registrations in 31 states that require voters to register by party, like Wisconsin doesn't, so this is only in states where they have the data, shows that independents account for 29.09% of voters in them, compared with 28.87% of Republicans. As recently as 2004, Republicans outpaced independents by nearly 10 percentage points. There are still way more registered Democrats. 39.66% of voters in those states are registered with the party. This marks the first time since party registration began in the early 1900s that the number of registered independents in the United States has surpassed members of either major political party. So here's the data going back to 2004. Blew the Dems. We reached our high with Obama in 43.62, and right now currently at 39.66. Republicans just been sinking, and independents have been gradually rising. Right. So before anyone chalks this up to having to do with the current occupant of the White House, it's worth parsing the trends. Of course, trends are either reinforced or disrupted by the person in the White House. I'm just going to say that. While independents have surpassed Republicans, there actually hasn't been a huge drop in GOP party registration since President Trump took office. GOP registration has dropped by 0.5 percentage point. The number of registered Democrats declined by nearly a full point over the same time. Independents have benefited from both drops. And they have been doing so for years. So basically, there are people who are leaving the parties and becoming. So since 2008, the trend lines for each party have been relatively steady. But while Democrats' registration fell more between 2016 and 18 than Republican ones, Republicans have fallen more since 2018, yada, yada, yada. So, that's interesting to know. And this is why in terms of turnout, it's huge, because we have more registered Democrats. The question is, will they vote? And yesterday answered part of that question in part of the country. So, okay. Do you know that Dems are made up of more than just leftists? Yeah, as we saw, let's look at another. I'm having so much fun with this data. I gotta go though. I'm meeting a friend. And what time is it? He said headed home at 6. Swing by any time after, and it's 6 now. At my time, anyway. So, let me see if I can wrap this up. I know Colorado is going to be kind of interesting. I know Sanders won it. So for those of you who are Bernie supporters, we've only been looking at where he's gotten blown out. So let's look at where he did well. And look at the difference between men and women and the age groups again. So here he got 11 delegates and 36% of the vote. I don't know what he did last time. I wish it would be kind of nice if we had the 2016 numbers, but we don't. Biden did well in Douglas County. All right. So once again, the division, 36% of men who in the state voted for Sanders, whereas only 13% voted for Biden, but they only made up 44% of all of voters, whereas women were 56% and went for Sanders slightly less, 28%, and Biden slightly more, 16%. White voters broke for Sanders. I guess in this case there wasn't enough sort of details to break down, so it was a pretty white state. And that 18%, I don't know why they're maybe I don't know if these are exit polls. Oh, they're exit polls reports. All right. So these are exit polls, and they didn't get enough to be able to do it. All right, fair enough. Looks like Colorado is a little bit on the incomplete side, so we might want to wait until there's better data that comes out on those. Trying to think. Oh, there was Tennessee. This is another point. Sorry, there is another point I wanted to make. So in 2016, Bernie did well and he won some places and got the sense that he should be the nominee because he was, so popular. And then he had to run again, but it wasn't against Hillary Clinton. And it seems that, I don't know if we can estimate it with, say, 7% or 12% of the vote, but it definitely seems that a core constituency that Bernie relied to get him over the edge or get him, across the line in states last time were people who just didn't like Hillary Clinton. And when you take away that factor, it seems like it took away some of the rationale to vote for Bernie. And that's another weakness of his candidacy. So if we look at Tennessee, Bernie won Tennessee in 2016. I don't know by how much. 2016 Tennessee primary. Yeah. Let's see if we can find that. Am I remembering this wrong? It was one of the southern states. Oh no, Hillary Clinton won that one. So what southern states? Was it Oklahoma? There was one that he won last time. Let's change it to Oak. Who won that? Primary. Okay, here we go. That was a southern state. All you southern states look alike to me. Kidding. Oklahoma. Last time Bernie won with 51.9% of the vote in 2016. Official primary results. So he did well. Look at this result by county. I mean, he looks like he squeaked her. She did well in 2 counties, but she got 41% of the total vote. He got 51, almost 52%, and it was Bernie Sanders green all over Oklahoma. This time, not so much. He got 25.4% of the vote, and I don't see where Sanders won any of his former counties. Oh my God, he got wiped out. Oh man. All right, let's break this down. We see the same breakdown we see by sex. 47% of the total population voting were men. They went 28% for Sanders, 38% for Biden. So Biden won even with that demo that tends to do best for Sanders. Women, again, he's struggling. Only 19%, whereas 35% went for Biden, and women made up 53% of the total voting population. We don't have a lot of breakdown here, unfortunately, by age, and it looks like they've got also some exit poll gaps here. I'm confident in saying the 10% of people aged 18 to 29 went overwhelmingly for Sanders. Interestingly, this is the first time I've seen this demo, the 30 to 44, come out so strong, and that's interesting. I don't know what's so different about Oklahoma, but once we get into the 45 and the 60-year-olds, we're right back to where we were before. Biden did fine with people who self-identify as Democrats. Biden took those, whereas people who identified as independents, Bernie took those. So your people are going to stand with you. You dance with those who brung you. Like, we all got each other's back. There's something about being a member of a party that makes a feeling of solidarity. And maybe it's the class solidarity that Bernie feels. But for us, it's our political value solidarity. For those deciding in the last few days, almost half, 40%, 41% were going for Biden. And those with no college degree also breaking for Biden, as well as college graduates. He swept those voters as well. Sanders, again, performing excellent with very liberal, self-identifying Democrats, but they only made up 18% of the total vote. Whereas moderate or conservatives, who made up half in Oklahoma. 39% to Biden, whereas Sanders got 11. And in terms of most important issue, where are these Democratic voters in terms of what they want in a candidate? 42% want agreement on major issues, but Sanders and Biden actually, they're pretty even there. It's a 4% difference. So Bernie's not dominating, agrees with me on major issues, but when it comes to the 55% of people from the exit poll who replied, 45% went for Biden because they wanted to beat Trump, and 20% went for Sanders. So, yeah, I guess this is kind of all the things I wanted to say. Economic message versus identity politics and civil issues and legal issues and stuff like that. I think I've made the case that Bernie's got to expand his discourse beyond just demonizing corporations and billionaires and establishment and big pharma and big banks and, grievance politics. He needs to build a message that's inclusive, not just divisive. The expectation versus the late, sort of like what people thought and then the late surge and why that all happened. Can Bernie change his, to expand his base of support versus his ideological consistency and fighting versus the corporation establishment? Yep, said that as well. One last thing. Oh, electability versus economic populism. And that again was when I was talking about the visions that the two men create in their speeches. And if you haven't paid attention to that, really go through and see how many issues that Bernie talks about in a stump speech aren't directly connected to an economic disruption or transformation of economic power versus Joe Biden. I would also, because it was 30% of the time, that's fine, but it's like 100%. Everything is racist. Everything is sexist. Everything is about Marx. And I just wish he'd talk about other concerns, because people have bigger concerns than, other concerns than that. If yes, you're concerned about healthcare, but you're also worried about not getting shot by the police so you don't have to go to the hospital, kind of thing. So just to clarify. And what was that? Yeah, and also, what picture do the candidates paint it with their words? And I would say, go listen to a Biden speech and go listen to a Bernie speech and get a sense for what vision are they presenting for the future of the America they want. And is it one that Americans want to, this is it. You have to kind of also recognize that the role of a president, you think about Obama. Obama was a master at this. When he spoke, he gave us a vision of America, of the America we wanted to live in. And it wasn't just about tearing down millionaires and breaking up banks and, doing a massive government takeover of healthcare. All right. It was It was more of a vision of what we could be. Like, we have it within us to transform things, to get something like Obamacare, and more states should definitely have the Medicare expansion. We can work on that. But, and he talked about reaching out to people who didn't support him. He talked about bringing Americans together. And yes, it was naive because Republicans are white supremacist jerks. But for Democrats and independents, we need to hear that. We still need that vision. It doesn't matter that in that case what the Republicans are going to do, but we want to. People respond emotionally to a president who can give them a vision of the America they want to live in, one that's freer and more just, and with less violence and less guns and less racism and phobias and hate, where people can just get on with their lives and walk around and be who they are and feel comfortable and have other people respect them for that. I mean, it's not that much to ask, but it seems to take a lot of work to get there. And to give people that vision of what we can be, and also giving us the belief in ourselves that we can make that happen. There's I feel that there's more of that rhetoric on the Biden side, and that's part of what people are responding to. Saying it's incoherent and senile, you're just going to miss the point. Because if Biden is incoherent and senile, that means incoherent and senile just romped Bernie's ass. So, you can keep demonizing the voters who vote for him, and you can demonize Joe, but he's going to probably be the nominee. I don't see it. I don't see a way to stop him, and maybe one will come up. But currently, I don't see any. He's got the popular vote. He's going to be getting the delegates. He's got better states coming up for him coming up. So, all right. So I think that's all the things that were in my head. How long did that take? I guess it took an hour. I was thinking it was going to take 20 minutes, but I had more things in my head than that. So I'm going to text my friend. Is it rude to text? On my way in 15. That means I have to leave you guys. On my way in 15. Not Quay. All right. Yeah. So who knows what's going to happen next? I don't. This is why, they play the game. And I do have to say, though, I last night was one of the most exciting election nights of my life. I've never seen that before. Like Pavlov's dog, every time I was listening. So I've got iTunes. No, not iTunes. I've got TuneIn, because it's TI instead of IT. I always flip around. And so I listen. I don't watch MSNBC because I can't subscribe to it in Germany, but I can subscribe to it versus a radio service. So I was listening, and every time it went dun dun dun. I was like, okay. And then I was like, who's it gonna be? Who's it gonna be? And Biden has won. I was like, oh my god, I can't believe Biden won another state. It was, until we hit I think it was Utah. Once we got past Texas, it was obvious that they weren't going to get California in, and Texas was going to take a while because people were lined up to vote around the corner for 2 hours to vote in Texas after polls closed. So I think I fell asleep at 5:30 in the morning. I basically I said I was going to take a half day off. I basically took a whole day off today. Sorted out. I got some work done, but I did have a bit of a late sleep. But anyway, yeah, I think I'm going to get going, guys. Keep watching the news. Keep watching what happens. I guess the next things to look out for is what does Elizabeth Warren do? And also another thing that we don't really think too much about, it kind of gets skipped over when it comes to the delegate race, but I think it's worth saying out loud at least once. Biden doesn't just have 305 delegates. He's going to get Buttigieg's 26, and Klobuchar's 7, and Bloomberg's 8. So, I don't actually know about whether, I don't know the rules in terms of whether a candidate can just transfer their delegates. This is what I'm assuming. So someone can tell me if I'm wrong. But if it's a case that, okay, if I won these delegates and they're my delegates, my pledged delegates, then I can assign them to whomever I want. And he's got the 3 endorsements, so he's got an extra 15, I hate doing math in public, 15, 35, 41? 40 plus, 40-ish. He's actually at 340-ish, 50, or 45. And that makes it just that much harder. I guess, Elizabeth Warren can pledge if she gets out and pledges her 18 delegates, but like that, the Buttigieg is like already canceled that out plus some. Yeah, so we'll see what happens. I keep saying that. I'm so astounded. And it looks like when it comes to my vote in Wisconsin in later this month, it might not matter anymore. It might pretty much already be decided by the time it comes to us. So the only thing we can do is watch and wait and see what happens. And of course, if it's your turn, vote. I've been Christy, guys. You've been awesome. Thank you for stopping by. I didn't look at the chat at all because I was all about like what was in my head. So maybe I'll go back and watch, but I hope you don't mind me not doing too much engagement. I just needed to get all this stuff out of my head first. And then I saw some nice comments and some snarky comments, so maybe I'll go back and watch. But anyway, until next time, I don't know when the next happy hour is going to be because of the whole D&D thing and yada, yada, yada. But of course, I'm sure Kevin will have some choice words. And I did see him on Twitter last night, so I know he stayed up all night watching it. As much as as late as I did, maybe even later. I finally faded at about 5:30 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, our time. And I'm sure he'll have lots of sweary things to say about that and American voters going forward. So, thanks again, you guys, for watching. I have been Christy. You have been awesome, and thank you for joining me for this very special edition of the Wine Ant Retort. Bernie got BTFO'd. Until, bye. I gotta press on my buttons.